Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name's Jeff Valentine, and if you are not supposed to be in the measuring and assessing study quality session, you can get up now, and we will not snicker until you leave the room. So I guess everybody's supposed to be here. You all have made the biggest mistake of the afternoon. I can promise you that. So a couple of background things. So one is I am a notorious pacer when I do this stuff, but I have been asked to plant myself in front of this microphone. So if you see me twitching and wanting to leave, you'll know what that's about, and I'll try to keep it under control. If I don't wander around, it's not because I'm not engaged. I'm just trying to make an okay video here, too. So we're being recorded, and so every question you ask is for posterity. So remember what they say about there are no dumb questions? You might want to think about that. So now's when I say, of course, there are no dumb questions. And my hope is that we're supposed to have about 75 minutes of time, and I hope that we will be able to go through what I have in 50 or 60 to leave plenty of time for conversation. If you have a question about substance or content, probably you should stop things and let's try to deal with those content questions right away. If you want to argue with me, or if you want to try to process what sort of these things mean for your own particular research question, then that's probably something that ought to wait till the end. But otherwise, I think that we're ready to go. So, without any further, let's just jump right into the issue. So we're trying to grapple today with the issue of study quality and what does it mean when we're doing a systematic review. So the idea that most people understand garbage in, garbage out is pretty clear. The problem is that in a systematic review, it's not quite that simple, but we can say pretty clearly that study quality probably does matter, and it probably matters in lots of important ways. For those of you who are at lunch today and listened to Larry Hedges' talk, you got a little bit of a flavor of what that is about. There is lots of research, mostly coming out of medicine, that suggests that however we define quality, those lower quality studies are associated with exaggerated treatment effects. That's another way of saying that in medicine, we think there's pretty good reason to believe that quality is negatively associated with effect size. So as quality goes down, effect sizes are larger and vice versa. In my experience, probably the safest thing to say is that, and again, my background is more in the social sciences, the safest thing to say here is that study quality probably does co-vary with effect size estimates, but probably behaves in sort of complicated ways, and I hope to give you a flavor of what that looks like today. The other thing I want to do before sort of jumping right into things is talk about a definition of study quality. And study quality, it turns out, is one of these terms that you have to be very careful about because different audiences mean different things by it. So my university administrators will call a study a good one if it increases the probability of landing external funding or something like that. So maybe that's not a great way of defining it, right? But I'm an academic, and we define study quality. We essentially conflate citation counts with study quality. We do it all the time, and that maybe isn't the best thing. A practitioner might say, did the study yield information that I can use in my practice today? And maybe that's a kind of a limited way of thinking about it. And then kind of the bottom line is, one of the bottom lines is that for most of us, study quality is one that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So I say that, and now's the time that I tell you that even though my day job involves doing systematic reviewing and meta-analysis, and I wouldn't pick another career, I'm actually really perfectly happy. I love what I do. My training is in social psychology, and you'll see that social psychology coming through, and so we'll talk about one famous study in social psychology here in a moment, and a lot of the way I think about study quality issues are really informed by that background. So from the standpoint of today's talk, I'd like you to maybe try to wrap your head around thinking about study quality as being a study that has a high degree of fit between the goals and the methods that are deployed in the service of those goals. So a lot of us are worried about effectiveness research, so we're probably talking about a specific set of methodologies. Some other people might have systematic review questions that are related to something else, like trying to figure out prevalence or something along those lines, and we need sort of different studies for that. But really, it's this issue between a study's goals and the fit with the methods that are used in that study that I think really turns out to be what the critical thing is. So today, I'm going to talk about a couple of typical but not recommended approaches to addressing study quality. One is to make the assumption that if it's peer-reviewed, it's good. The other is that quality scales lead you closer to the truth. I think I'll probably hit you over the head with reasons not to believe either of those assertions. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about some more suggested approaches of addressing study quality and systematic review. So these involve essentially setting highly defensible inclusion criteria, coding other sources of variability in study quality, doing univariate tests of study quality indicators, and then if you're able to, multivariate tests of the effects of study quality. So that's basically where we will end up at the end of the day. And if you want to leave right now, you have, I mean, this is the plan, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, so here's my social psychology background coming in. It's a very classic study by Lord and colleagues, Lord, Ross, and Lepper, who were interested in illustrating how people see what they expect to see. So they identified a bunch of participants who were either firm proponents or firm opponents of an issue. And then we did what social psychologists do all the time. We randomly assigned people to one of two conditions. So they received a study, and the only modification in that study was that it either confirmed or did not confirm the position that this person already held. So it's this 2-by-2 design, where they get randomly assigned to a study that's either supporting or not supporting their pre-existing beliefs. All of the participants received commentary that was critical of the study's method. So this was a study that wasn't really strong, and the commentary, think about it as a peer review, commentary said, you know, there are all these problems. And then they were asked to rate, the participants were asked to rate at the end the quality of the study. So somebody tell me what Lord and colleagues found. Someone who's not a social psychologist, tell me what Lord and colleagues found. What they decided was depending on what their pre-existing beliefs were, right? So if people had the position that received a study that was congruent with their beliefs, and they tended to say it was a good study. If it was not congruent with their beliefs, they tended to say it was not a good study. So what's interesting is the participants who received a conclusion other than what they were expecting tended to rate the study was flawed, and the way they did that was they paid attention to the critical commentary, right? So essentially what happens when we receive something that doesn't go with our expectations, it triggers these processes that makes us look more in depth at what's going on. And these processes then allow us to retain our original beliefs. So if I read a study that says, you know, this particular program works, and I'm a believer of that program, I stop, right? Because all is well with the world. But if the study says, oh, this program's harmful, red flags go up, and I say, that can't be. So I now start looking for reasons why they're going to be wrong, right? And of course, the perfect study has never been done, never will be done. So I'm able to find reasons that let me retain my belief that this particular program works pretty well. So this is one of the issues that we're going to be grappling with throughout today's talk, and trying to figure out how to move from relatively subjective and imprecise and sort of conclusion-bound processes that judge study quality to something that's a little more objective. And we're going to try to do that in a way that makes sense. So the first thing that people have done is they said, well, you know, we have this thing that's called a peer review. So let's say that if it's peer-reviewed, it's a good study. And so has anybody ever read a systematic review or meta-analysis where the authors have made the assertion to ensure study quality, we included only peer-reviewed studies, right? So raise your hand. Go ahead and if you think you've seen that, right? So more, 2/3 of us have seen that. And if we had had this talk 10 years ago, it would have been 90% of us probably. It's a pretty common thing to do. And I'll argue that peer review is an imperfect marker at best. In some ways, it may be a negative indicator. So you have to be worried about that. But that was more of a sort of opinion aside, so maybe don't pay as much attention to that. But so why is it that peer review is maybe not a very good study proxy for study quality? Well, one issue is that it simply was not designed solely as a methodological quality screen. Okay, so if you're an academic, raise your hand, please. Okay, so am I the only one who's had a paper turned down because it didn't make a sufficient theoretical contribution? So am I the only one? I'm not the only one, probably, right? But so this idea that studies have to make a sufficient theoretical contribution is not really one that we're all that interested in terms of a systematic review and meta-analysis, right? And so one of the things that's going on here is that, in fact, when I said publication status is a negative indicator, the peer review process is, in fact, biased against exactly the kind of research that we need, and that's replication research. So we would like a whole bunch of really highly similar studies, and there are a bunch of peer reviewers out there saying, "Oh, that's been done. That's been done. We know this. We know that. That's been done." You know, so we can talk about more about that later if you want. But that's probably one of the really important reasons and easily pointed out reasons that peer review is just not a very good proxy for study quality. It's also the case that sometimes study authors are not able to find a journal that's a good fit for the question, the population studied, or the outcomes measured. And there's a cost associated in terms of time and such, getting manuscripts prepared for different journals, and sometimes people just give up. Those are reasons that are independent of what we would think of as study quality, really sort of how sort of valid, in a sense, the effect size estimate is. So in addition to being biased against replication research, we actually have studied the peer review process a lot. And we know that the peer review process is biased not only against replication research, but biased against the null hypothesis. So we like studies that find something, right, regardless of however much sense that makes. And in fact, I think this is, and Larry talked about this, Larry Hedges talked about this a little bit during our lunch session. The idea that studies really have to have statistically significant results is a pretty we have, I think, a fair amount of evidence about that, probably a lot of evidence about that, really. Essentially, every systematic review and meta-analysis I've looked at finds a negative relationship between sample size and effect size, and it's exactly what you expect to see in the presence of publication bias. So we know that this process is biased against the null hypothesis, and in fact, I think it's indicative of a larger sense in which our scientific research generation process is flawed. And I'll take an aside now and tell you about a story I heard on a study I heard on the radio. I think it was last week, and I don't have the citation, but maybe somebody else has heard this. So these researchers went out and they studied the behavior of parents with children who used what we call a binky, but maybe a dummy if you're from the UK, or a pacifier, that. And so what's interesting is that anybody who's ever had kids will tell you that those pacifiers fall out occasionally. And parents vary in terms of their response to that. Sometimes they'll just stick it in the kid's mouth, right? Sometimes they'll wash it off, and sometimes they put it in their own mouths and then give it to the kid. And so it's interesting. What's interesting about this is that the researchers found that there's an apparent protective benefit associated with putting the pacifier in the parent's mouth and giving it to the kid, because the kids in that group had less eczema, a skin disease, and less asthma. Okay? So I promise you, I'm not a doctor, but I promise you, there is no theory that says that there should be transmission that specific to the kids, right? And so what probably happened is the researchers measured 200 different things, right? And they're picking and talking about on National Public Radio in the United States these two outcomes that happen to be statistically significant, and then later on people are going to follow that up. So we are now diverting healthcare research dollars to studying that what I'm going to think is probably likely chance finding, right? And 3 or 4 people are going to do it, and they say we can't replicate it, and people will give up. So anyway, that stuff shouldn't happen, and yet it happens all the time. So we know that the peer review process is biased against the null hypothesis. It's biased in favor of the reviewer's pre-existing beliefs. It may be biased in favor of famous scholars. I think maybe there's a little less evidence on that. But the other thing is that it certainly is characterized by low inter-rater reliability. Anybody who's ever studied inter-rater reliability of these peer review decisions, you get okay reliability at the global accept reject level, but anything beyond that, there's no agreement really. And the other issue is, of course, that everyone agrees that low-quality studies do, in fact, get published in peer-reviewed outlets, right? So not only do we have good reason to think that the peer review process doesn't work exactly the way we'd like it to work, but in fact we can see with our own eyes that it doesn't work very well. And the other issue is some of you probably work for research firms or maybe work for a nonprofit or work for government, and publication is not always the goal of research, right? So if you think about an applied dissertation, I work with teachers and principals in schools. They're not really interested in going the extra step to get their stuff published, and a lot of times work done for governments or nonprofits can be excellent, but publication is simply not a goal of the research. And so to kind of summarizing all these comments up, Gene Glass a few years ago said, it's one thing to believe that peer-reviewed guarantees truth. It's quite another to believe that all truth appears in peer-reviewed journals. Right? I mean, and that is, I think it hits the nail on the head there. Nobody believes that all truth appears in peer-reviewed journals, and so we've got to figure out a way to do that. We've got to figure out a way to address that problem. For the purposes of doing a systematic review and a meta-analysis, part of the answer is that, in fact, we should not limit our reviews to published studies. I think most people understand that now, but there are still people working out there who probably want to use publication status as a proxy for study quality. That was actually a well-timed slide because I desperately needed something to drink there. I cannot tell you how many of these quality scales have been developed, but I can tell you that the world is swimming in them, and I have contributed to the drops in that pool. You can rest assured that I will not foist that scale on you today. So there are a lot of these quality scales. Let me just, the bottom line is probably these things ought to be avoided, but let me tell you a little bit about how they're kind of designed. So essentially what I think the major difference between quality scales is that they vary in terms of their specificity and their coverage. So what do I mean by specificity? Well, it's the extent to which the items on the scale are operationally defined. So you'll find quality scales that are very, very operational, that tell you exactly, with essentially no judgment on the part of the person coding the study, how to interpret an item. And then there are others that will just say something like, is attrition a problem? Well, what kind of attrition, and what do you mean by problem? Kind of thing. Generally, I think specificity is a good thing. And a few years ago, Harris Cooper and I coined the term, well, we stole the term cognitive algebra from cognitive psychology. So what I'll say here is that you can think of cognitive algebra as the idiosyncratic perspectives that different individuals bring to a judgment. The reason that this comes up in the specificity part is that the higher the degree of specificity, the less cognitive algebra you have coming in. And that's probably a good thing. Cognitive algebra was originally just a descriptor for how people make judgments about other people and how they kind of put things together and add them up in these kind of unique ways. From the standpoint of trying to judge the quality of a study, cognitive algebra is a bad thing, because if all 60 of us in this room are bringing somewhat different perspectives, we're not going to have very good reliability probably on those decisions. So the main issue here is that people can apply different standards to the same judgment tasks. So what I mean by a lot of attrition, it may be different from what you mean by a lot of attrition. And then people can also weight the same attributes differently. So I may say, well, attrition's not really a problem in this area, and you might say, well, it really is a big problem in this area. And that makes this whole exercise harder to grapple with. So we talked about specificity. Coverage is the extent to which multiple sort of aspects of study quality are addressed. So there are some scales that will only attempt to address kind of the causal validity or the internal validity of a study. And then there will be other studies that try to do essentially everything, including like addressing whether the study was ethically conducted. So that's sort of kind of even an extra statistical methodological things that you will find these scales doing. And what's interesting here, especially when you have studies that cover sort of more than one aspect of validity or these extra statistical, extra methodological things, theoretically they're unrelated. It should be the case that a study that has a certain degree of, studies that tend to be high in internal validity, theoretically could have high external validity too, and high measurement validity and all those other things. So they should be unrelated. But we end up with a situation where it's probably best to assess multiple dimensions or multiple domains of quality, but then often what people will try to do is get to a single number that summarizes across those dimensions. And if those dimensions are uncorrelated with one another, it's hard to see how that summary number makes any sense. So it would be sort of like me saying, well, the person I had breakfast with this morning was from the United States, so she gets a 1 there, and she was a football fan, so she gets a 4 there, so that's 5, and she has a PhD, so she gets a 2 there, so that's a 7, so she gets 7 on my scale. What does that 7 mean, right? You're adding up all these things. Well, you're laughing, right? But people do this, and so. Another one of the favorite stories I get to tell is work done by Peter Juni and colleagues. So I'm going to want to take a second to make sure I explain this well because it's a complicated study. And raise your hand if you want me to try to explain something else. So what Peter Juni and his colleagues did was they went out and they found an existing meta-analysis on the effects of a new drug relative to the standard version. This was actually a really important research question because this was on how we treat people who come out from surgery and we're addressing the chance that they're going to get blood clots in their legs. And blood clots in the legs, post-operative deep vein thrombosis kills people. So it's a really, really important question. They were looking at whether this stuff that's called low molecular weight heparin is in effectiveness compared to standard heparin. So they went out, they found this meta-analysis, and then they also located 25 different quality scales. And I'll just say it was not hard for them to find 25 quality scales. It took me about 2 hours of combing through stuff to find these, so it just really doesn't take long. And 24 of these 25 quality scales had been published in peer-reviewed medical journals. Okay, so presumably they're done by well-qualified people. What Peter and his colleagues did then is they conducted 25 separate meta-analyses. So it's one meta-analysis using each quality scale. So with quality scale A, and they did the meta-analysis, and they did quality scale B, and they did the meta-analysis. And what they were interested in is what the high-quality studies said relative to the low-quality studies. Okay, so with quality scale A, they said, oh, the high-quality study said this, the low-quality study said that. Then they went to B. High-quality study said this, low-quality study says that. So does that seem reasonable? All the way down to 25. Okay, so what did they find? In about half the meta-analyses, the high-quality and the low-quality studies agreed about the effectiveness of the drug. But now, in bold, in about 25% of the meta-analyses, the high-quality studies suggested that the new drug was more beneficial than the old. And about 25% of the meta-analyses, the low-quality studies suggested that the new drug was more beneficial than the old. Okay? Yes, that's so I probably won't read the quote that Harris Cooper and I came up about this. It's a really disheartening finding, right? If you want to use a quality scale, this is really disheartening. So you can think about if the original authors of that meta-analysis had used quality scale A versus quality scale B, they could have gotten totally different answers. If somebody else wants to go back and redo this, if you're working with a sophisticated doctor and the doctor said, hey, they've given me all this information, but I want to apply a quality scale, and that doctor goes out and finds a scale, 1 out of the potential 25, and she does the meta-analysis with that scale, her results depend on which scale she got. And the drug that she's going to give me depends on the scale that she got, right? So that's problematic. So the idea that the conclusion about the effectiveness of the new drug depends on the specific quality scale chosen, I think, is really problematic. It could mean that study quality doesn't matter in this area, but I think it's much more likely to mean that the study quality scales were so bad that they masked the effects of study quality. So this is from our 2008 paper. These findings go beyond the immediate debate about the effectiveness of the treatment in question and strike at the heart of the scientific enterprise. Even though the quality scales Juni et al. Examined were all developed by well-qualified medical researchers, these researchers apparently disagreed enough about the definition of quality in medical research that applying their standards individually led to a hopelessly confused picture of the state of the evidence. As such, Juni et al.'s findings cast serious doubt on the growing practice of using quality scales to evaluate evidence. So yeah, that's hard. So you might want to ask, well, what is it about these scales that's so bad? And let me just go back and remind you that we talked about specificity and coverage. So specificity is the extent to which the items on the scales are operationally defined, and coverage is one way to think about how many different aspects of study quality that these scales attempt to assess. So if you look at these 25 scales, first thing that jumps out at you is that they have very different numbers of items. So the scales range between 3 items and 34 items. So those are really different kinds of things. And what the reason here is that there's differences in coverages. So you can bet that, in fact, I think I remember now, the 3-item scale were 3 items related to internal validity. Right, that was it. And then you can imagine that 34 is probably some neurotically compulsive person like me. The one we wrote has between 63 and 65 items, depending on, you don't want to know, I'll just tell you. Okay, so there's differences in coverage across these things, and then there's different weightings of the same criteria. So this took me 10 minutes to find. So I'm working with these things. I find 2 scales that have 14 items. Beckerman et al. Said, they both had an item about masking. Beckerman et al. Said masking is worth 7% of the total points. Brown et al. Said, no, it's worth 23% of the total points. There's no agreement. No agreement between those scales about how important masking is, right? Essentially 3 or 4 times difference, 3 times difference. And in fact, there's no empirical justification for any weighting scheme. No empirical justification. And that includes whether you're going to weight them equally or whether you're going to weight something 2 or 3 or 4 or 20 times more than something else. There's no empirical justification for that. And you need one to support this. Larry Hedges at lunch today expressed optimism, or expressed the idea that people think that sometimes study quality issues balance out. I'm not convinced I believe that. Most of the things that I read treat study quality issues as sort of adding up in the same direction. But in fact, we actually don't know how it works. I think it's entirely possible that some problems positively affect effect size estimates and others negatively bias those estimates. And probably things are just depend completely on the area that is being addressed, the research area in which one is working. But even if this happens, no quality scale has ever attempted to deal with that. And there's essentially no empirical work that will help us figure it out. So we just don't have any way of really knowing. And then the other thing I'd say, before getting to, I think, the big issue, the difference between study quality and reporting quality is often ignored. So just because a report is silent about some quality dimension, it doesn't necessarily mean that study quality is low. So if you ask people, why didn't you report characteristic X, the most common response you get is, journal space considerations, right? So we had 4,000 words to submit, and so we had to we had to make choices about what got in there. And so we have to worry a lot about the difference between study reporting quality and actual study quality, and that's hard to deal with in these quality scales as well. But here is, I think, the big issue. Most of these quality scales rely on a single score to represent study quality. And usually the items on the scales are summed, or maybe they're weighted first, but the result is a single number. And so as I sort of illustrated earlier, there really is no theoretical reason to expect one aspect of study quality to be related to another aspect of study quality. And when you're reducing this complex thing that's called study quality down to one number, you can end up with situations where you get something like this. So you have one study that has high internal validity but low external validity, and it gets an 80. And then you have another study that has the opposite characteristics, low internal validity but high external validity, and it gets an 80. That's in no way is that helpful, right? So we've got to figure out some way outside of that box. I do think one of the positive aspects of a study quality assessment system, like a study quality scale, is that it's better to have the standards open to the inspection of others than not. And these scales tend to, relative to the alternatives, they tend to have less reliance on the reviewer's cognitive algebra. But they have their other problems that are probably not desirable. But we've got to figure out a way to make the judgments more open to the inspection of others. So it's not enough to have somebody say, oh, well, this is a good study and this is a bad study, and not really know, not have any evidence that the standards were applied consistently across both the studies, and in fact that the same standards were applied across studies. Another important point is that anytime we do a study quality assessment, I think we need to recognize that study quality is a multidimensional construct. So this is another way in which you can understand what leads people to say, well, let's build some study quality scale items that assess internal validity, and another set of items that assess measurement validity, and another set that assess external validity, because those are all important, and we want to be able to talk about all of those things, but we have to do it in the right way. It's also the case, I think, that study context matters a lot, and it probably matters a lot more than people realize. And just as an example, Kathleen McHugh and I a few years ago did some research where we were looking at attrition in school-based studies. So these are mostly students in early elementary grades, and we think there's probably pretty good evidence that when somebody is missing from a post-test, from some evaluation in that context, early elementary school, it's just random, right? In fact, the results look very random. We never would have guessed that, right, going into it. Certainly did not occur to me. But so in school-based studies, especially with younger kids, attrition is more likely to be random. If you're doing drug treatment interventions, there's no way that attrition is random, right? Because you know that serious hardcore drug users are the ones more likely to leave the study. So you've got to worry about that a lot. So the context in which the study occurs matters a lot, and that means it's going to be really, really hard for us to develop generic rules that are just applied across the board. I see some people smiling and shaking their heads. I'm glad to affirm your pre-existing beliefs. I know that you won't argue with me, so that's good. The last point here is that we will need a lot more empirical work to understand the relative importance of the quality dimensions, but this work has to be contextually bound. So I think you might be able to do that for early elementary school, but probably the stuff you do in high school is going to be different, right, or at least merits its own investigation. And certainly the stuff that somebody might do in a drug treatment center is going to need its own investigation, because these issues of what constitutes study quality are very much contextually bound. Okay, so two things you don't do, right? We're not going to let peer review be a proxy for study quality. And we're not going to, under any circumstances, use a study quality scale, especially one that comes up with a single number, right? We're going to avoid those. So what can you do? And I'm not just here to throw stones. I'm here to try to help. So I think that, and most of us probably already do this to some extent, but I really think that what we should do and what we should continue to recommend to people is that we use a combination of two strategies. We're going to use a priori rules that govern what gets included in the review, and then we'll use an empirical investigation of the extent to which variations in study and quality, once included, are associated with variability in effect sizes. So we're going to ask the question, for this review, given that we've included these kinds of studies or studies with these characteristics, does study quality seem to matter, and how? The thing that I cannot stress enough, but I've hinted at, is that both of these strategies require a deep level of substantive, methodological, and statistical knowledge. So this is why we put together teams that have a lot of different people in there. If we are interested in an effectiveness review, I need to make sure that I know somebody, probably multiple somebodies, who understand the conditions in which these interventions are implemented. So one of the things I'm often interested in is how is it that people got into their groups if they weren't randomly assigned? How did they self-select in, and what kind of people self-selected into that? The more we know about that process, the better we're going to be at the end, the more we're going to be able to model it, essentially. And so that's going to help. But I can't do that for most research questions because I'm not the substantive expert. I need to have a partner who will help with that. And then the methodological and statistical knowledge also cannot be underestimated. So again, I think a reiteration, it's a near certainty that quality dimensions are contextually bound. Okay, it's a near certainty. Is it a question? What's the difference between methodological and statistical knowledge? And I would say that there's probably an overlap, but the methodology probably involves more sort of the mechanics of the research design. So if you're using a cluster randomized experiment, it's nice to have somebody who understands sort of how those clusters get assigned and kind of the issues that go there. Mostly, I think you can conflate them and it would be okay. The other issue I would say here, the other point I would make here is that we have to think really very carefully about how potential threats to validity play out for each of our research questions. And the way that I answer that for one is going to be at least slightly different and maybe moderately different and sometimes wildly different for a different research question. And so we have to be prepared for that. This means that you cannot develop probably one quality scale and expect it to be applicable across all dimensions. There is hope. You might be able to develop a quality scale for the internal validity dimension for research in early elementary grades and come pretty close, probably. But trying to transport that to social work, to a drug treatment program, to a clinical program, to a drug trial is probably asking too much of the instrument. Okay, so the two strategies, and we'll start with the a priori rules, and it's almost certainly the case that some rules about study quality will be adopted ahead of time, right? And I go back to one of the very early for us, meta-analyses was Gene Glass's work on class size and achievement. And Gene Glass at the time would say, well, we didn't do any study quality screens. We didn't worry about that. That's not exactly true. They did not include one group experiments, right? So they said, we're going to kick these out a priori and we're just going to look at two group experiments. That's a study quality screen. So most of us are doing something that at least looks like that. If you're working in the Cochrane collaboration, you might say, we'll do what Cochrane normally does and we will exclude anything that's a non-randomized experiment. Or if you're in my world, you might say, well, we're going to exclude non-randomized studies that don't control for a pretest of the outcome, perhaps. Or maybe you say, we're going to exclude studies that are lacking a comparison group. Something along those lines you're probably going to say. It's not the case that every study is going to make it in. There's going to be some sort of quality mechanism that happens at the beginning, and you need to be very explicit about that. And the more that you can justify that decision, the better off you are. right? So if I were, it would be best for somebody to, this never happens in Cochrane, but it would be best for somebody to say we're excluding non-randomized experiments because we have pretty good idea that non-randomized experiments in this area are biased, and there would be a body of research that would talk about that. So something along those lines. The other, I think, harder part is, with the exception of these few highly defensible exclusion criteria, I think that you have to think very carefully about what study quality means in your area and code for the presence or absence of those indicators, and then test whether the presence or absence of those indicators co-varies with effect size. So I might include both randomized and non-randomized experiments, and then I'm going to code them. So I'm going to say, well, study A was a randomized experiment and study B was a non-randomized experiment. And then if I have a nice collection of those studies, I can do a moderator test that compares the effects observed in the randomized versus the non-randomized experiments. And then eventually I can start having an evidence base that can say, this is how the assignment mechanism seems to matter in this research area. And I think that's generally a very nice thing to do, if incomplete. The reason I think it's incomplete is that it's a univariate approach, and so that any intercorrelation between study characteristics makes it harder to interpret the results of the moderator test. So I don't see Mark Lipsey or David Wilson in here, but those two have a very nice way of putting this. They say that studies have personalities, and they're very much right. So it turns out that when you look at collections of studies, that there are going to be characteristics that co-vary. Teams that tend to randomly assign participants to groups will also tend to select a particular kind of measurement method and so on. And that intercorrelation makes things very difficult for the interpretation of the moderator test. But we might be able to do meta-regression if we have enough studies. So, and we can kind of get sort of a multivariate approach here where we can look at the independent effects of the study quality indicator, controlling for all other indicators, and then also perhaps get what we think might be a less biased estimate of the effect size we're interested in. The drawback here is that we need a lot of studies. So Ryan is a rough guess of more than 30, a nice, would you say more or a little bit less? Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that's right. So the problem here is that the variance estimates of the regression coefficients tend not to be real stable unless you have a lot of studies. So it's just better to have more. So what I wanted to do before kind of wrapping up is show you how I might approach this study quality issue in a limited way, and I'll embed this in a discussion of a review that I was part of for mentoring interventions for youth. So I'll just be talking about these things as they're related to internal validity. So we were interested in whether mentoring works. And so mentoring, if you're not familiar with it, involves, in this case, pairing an adult with a youth, usually aged 12 to 18. And the idea is that they will interact for a couple of hours, most every week, probably at least 3 times a month, something like that.
Quick question.
Yeah. They are often at-risk youth, but you have to remember that the word at-risk means a lot of different things. Just that. So we included in this review randomized experiments, quasi-experiments, and non-randomized experiments, but only if the authors controlled for a pretest of the outcome. So that gives you kind of an idea of the things that we were able to say. We tried to say at the beginning that we were interested in looking at. And then so at the title and abstract screening stage, we asked the question, what was the research design? And we just got rid of all these things that were one group studies and things like that. We ended up with a set of studies that we wanted to meta-analyze, and we code them for a variety of characteristics, including the design, so whether it was randomized experiment or whether it was quasi-random or a non-randomized experiment but used statistical control. We coded baseline equivalents for a whole bunch of demographic and related variables. We also coded attrition, so the loss of participants both overall and for each group from the randomized sample, and then we coded the effect size. So then, once we have these set of about 80 studies, I think, coded, we were able to compare the effects observed in studies with better characteristics with those observed in the studies with the less desirable characteristics. So we could ask questions that look like this. Do randomized and quasi-randomized experiments yield effects similar to those seen in the non-randomized experiments? So this is starting to build that evidence base. Do effect sizes vary as a level of the overall attrition? Do effect sizes vary as a function of the magnitude of differential attrition? So how many people get lost, what percentage of the sample gets lost from one group versus the other? What is the effect of the design while holding the effects of differential attrition constant? So those kinds of questions that we're able to ask that I think go a lot farther down the road to providing maybe a better estimate of the effect of mentoring with some quality considerations taken into account. Okay, so if you see me in a grocery store in 10 years, right, and if you say, I didn't use a quality scale, right, I'll be perfectly happy, right? So that's one bottom line thing. The other bottom line is, if you also say, and I didn't use peer review as a proxy for study quality, perfectly happy, right? So those are the two things to remember. I think if you could think carefully about what kind of best practice might look like, with the idea that study quality is almost certainly contextually bound, almost certainly. So think about how those quality indicators play out for the research question that you're asking right now. And then you can set a few highly defensible criteria to exclude studies on. You can hopefully include all the other studies and code them and see if you can investigate the effects of those study quality dimensions empirically. And I think that's it. So I have my email address there. These slides will be online if they're not online now, so you could certainly drop me a line and I'm happy to help. And there are some recommended readings and stuff there. So let me go back to here, and 35 minutes is 50 minutes, I guess. Not too bad. So how about questions? One question. Go ahead.
So isn't in terms of the study quality versus the systematic review quality? When I can see that criteria help us to assess the whole research systematic review quality. But if someone wants to really use one study of the research systematic review, probably this criteria will not be very helpful. So in terms of, or even no one, but probably 5, for example, one type of intervention. So that would not really be helpful for the person who wanted to know if this evaluation, this study was high quality or low quality.
So,
except relative to the whole systematic review.
Yeah, so let me reflect back on your question, because I think I was expecting you to ask one question and you asked a slightly different question. So what I heard you say was you brought up the distinction between the quality of the individual component studies in a systematic review and the quality of the systematic review itself. And I agree that those are kind of related but different things, right? One can have really great studies and then do a poor systematic review, and one example of that might be if I go out and go to my bookshelf and I pull down 5 studies on after-school programs and I do the meta-analysis on those. Most of us in this room wouldn't think that it's a high-quality systematic review, right? But those studies might be perfect, or as close to perfect as we're going to get. So I agree with you that there's a distinction between the systematic review quality and the individual component study quality. So can you follow? Do you want to follow up?
Well, I think that's one dimension of what I was asking. I think what I have in our mind is that this methodology is about the whole systematic review quality based on the individual single component, quality component. But I have seen sometimes people use the systematic review results not only generally, but also as a component.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, I'm not sure how useful it is for them, this methodology, to assess the quality of that specific component?
So I think I'm closer now. So
I'm always very kind of like, I'm not very clear, but
no,
talk like.
no. If this doesn't fully answer your question, come back up. And so I think you're saying that sometimes people will, there will be a systematic review, but then individuals will take only components of that, like one flavor, one type of the intervention, and base maybe policy decisions on sort of this one slice. I can see how that might be okay, and I can see how that might not be okay. I think it's hard for me to make an abstract statement about whether I think that's a good thing or not. Do you want to talk at the end? Okay. There's a question over here.
I have two questions. Okay. I'm assuming that in this type of effective and systematic review, what you would include, your criteria inclusion automatically excludes all the qualitative narrative-based studies. Is that a correct assumption?
No. I would say that the research question and the research question should help you set the inclusion criteria, and if
Effect size is automatically the quantitative value. You cannot say this intervention was good and this was bad.
yeah.
You have to be able to compute effect size. And so if the study was qualitative,
Yeah.
you don't have that.
I think that there's a distinction between including a study in a meta-analysis and including a study in a systematic review. So for a meta-analysis, the statistical accumulation of the results of multiple studies, then clearly one needs an effect size for that. But there can be a systematic review that's larger. Yeah. Okay.
The second question I had is, like you have coded different studies according to different information, attrition and all that, so that you can possibly do a moderator or subgroup analysis of data. What if some of the studies, different studies do not report the same thing?
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah, so the question is, when you're coding studies for moderator analysis, what if the different studies don't report kind of the same thing? And I've never had that happen. Has anybody had that happen? It's tough, right? So there are lots of things that you can do, though. We now live in a world that's very well connected, and for at least recent research, one ought to be able to locate the authors and ask them the question. Now, authors vary in the extent to which they're able to produce the answer that you're looking for, but that's one thing I would say should always be done. Be alert to the fact that sometimes information can be converted from one type to another, right? So we might be able to, it's hard for me to think of an example on the fly, but you might be able to use something for another purpose. You might also go in with rules established ahead of time that tell you what you're going to believe in the absence of no information, right? And so in my research, I will always say, if the study authors do not explicitly state that groups were formed using random assignment, some other mechanism was used, right? Because in educational research, they will always tell you that bit of information. So my assumption in the absence of information is that it's a non-randomized experiment. And so maybe that's helpful too. But your overarching point is correct, that study authors are frustratingly creative with respect to the kinds of information that they end up reporting.
Last one here. The different information that you can convert, as you said, between each other, is there software that you can recommend that it does these conversions for you?
So the question is, I made the point that sometimes we can convert information from one kind to the other, and the question is there software that will do that? And specifically with effect size stuff, there are algebraic transformations from one metric to another. And there are approximations for other things, and certainly in R and in Stata, there are routines that will do that for you. There's commercial software available. You can purchase textbooks. You can find almost certainly find formulas available online for free. All of my effect size conversion stuff occur in Excel, and you can even get Google Docs to do. Google Spreadsheet to do a lot of this stuff. So.
The Campbell website has an effect size.
Oh, and yeah, that's right. So David Wilson has a Excel-based effect size calculator that will do all that stuff for you. Thank you. So go to the Campbell website. Question over here?
I actually like quality. I don't know what to call them scales. I'm more used to the term critical appraisal tools. Particularly in health science, there's quite a few of those to help people just go through and critically appraise both systematic reviews and a variety of forms of sort of basic studies. And they don't try to put things in terms of like an overall score, which I agree with you doesn't make any sense. But in using them, I use these as part of instruction for graduate students in research methodology courses, and which is a little bit different than sort of saying, here's the scale, and then are they sort of interrelated?
Yeah.
But it's almost like you're training people to develop an inter-rater reliability by using some of these things. And of course, there's so many of them, and some, are very small. I think the standard's around 10, which is a manageable one, I find. But I find them extremely effective, and just the quality of students being able to critically appraise studies really changes dramatically over a couple of months of having the practice of doing this and bringing in studies of their interest that they then critically appraise. If anything, you have to help them to back off, because again, as you said, there's no such thing as a perfect study.
Yeah.
So have you had that experience? Or?
So the questioner was getting at the idea that, well, in his teaching, he's used these things called critical appraisal tools, which look a lot like quality scales, but perhaps don't sum study quality into a single number, and finds them to be a useful training tool, and has asked if I have found that too.
So in 10 years, I want to come back and say, I'm using these.
Yeah. Well, so the analog, I would say, is, you're approaching, I think the activities are different enough that we have to be careful. So you're approaching this from a training standpoint, and I agree that from a training standpoint, structure at the beginning helps a lot, right? Because you need to make sure that students have a foundation of things to look for, and then you can, once they're comfortable with those, you can throw them a loop and say, well, actually, maybe this isn't important in this area, but that's kind of a higher order question. And so it requires more development on their part.
More cognitive algebra.
More experience, maybe. More tolerance for ambiguity in a lot of ways. So I will agree. The standpoint of, in my experience, when we do quality appraisals for studies in my meta-analysis class, almost universally the students say, I will never look at a study the same way again. Right? Because even beginning graduate students read the abstract and maybe the introduction and maybe the discussion, right? And I couldn't care less. This is all fish wrapped for me until I get to the methods and the results. And then that's the stuff that I'm really interested in. So I think our experiences are similar, but the activities are different, right? And quality appraisal for inclusion to a meta-analysis or weighting in a meta-analysis, I think, is a really dicey sort of thing. So I wouldn't start there. Gary?
Jeff, this is a concrete question, I guess, for doing a meta-analysis that might be relevant to one you're working on. In the alternative teacher training literature, two authors look at the exact same data set, the same teachers in Houston, TFA teachers in Houston, and come up with different answers by having slightly different assumptions on how they set it up. How do you, what's the strategy there for sorting this out? Obviously, we don't I think we don't just say, well, let's use the average effect size. And so what do you want to do, or how should we deal with situations like that?
So Dr. Ritter's in the back there saying that sometimes people will look at the same set of data and come up with different effect sizes depending on which model they choose. Why not average them? And actually, I think what I would argue is that you need to make whatever choice you make, that your first choice should be made at the protocol stage. Right, so you need to be aware that this is going to happen if it will happen for you, and talk about how you're going to do that. I would argue there are probably cases in which averaging them is the appropriate thing to do. There are probably cases in which it's not, right? And so probably the way I would begin to think about it is, what variables do I want in the model, and what variables do I not want in the model? And to give you an example, I do work on a sideline in students' beliefs about themselves as a student, sort of how good they feel about themselves as a student, how good they think they are. And the model that I have in my head is that if students have a lot of efficacy, then that leads to motivation, and motivation leads to achievement. So if I'm looking at a big data set, I don't want motivation controlled in that data set, because to me, motivation is part of the causal chain. So I can say, you know, if we're doing this kind of study, if it controls from motivation, probably that's an effect I'm not interested in. So that's kind of what you might see in the alt-cert kind of thing. We'll make decisions at the protocol stage to the extent that we can. Yes?
I agree with your suggestion that we should not depend on the single quality scale or field quality scales. My issue is different from that, different from the single component of the meta-analysis. It's about the review, about this, review or meta-analytic review. We have only few, I think, quality indicators like Prisma or the M-star.
Mm-hmm.
In those cases, how can I get evaluate those kind of reviews?
So is the question, how do we evaluate the quality of a systematic review? Well, so you mentioned the two, right? There's PRIMSA, and what's the other? Yeah, AmStar, right. Yeah. I think that, are there other, what is it?
Critical appraisal skills program has one for systematic reviews.
Where can we get that? It's called CASP.
CASP. Google about if you Google critical appraisal skills program, you'll find it.
Critical Appraisal Skills Program,
It's,
right.
NHS, National Service Program. And you'll find all of those that this gentleman, he mentioned the appraisal tools that students like a lot there because they're annotated, give hints about them.
So those are relatively specific, right? If they build in hints as to what they're looking for,
Suggestions.
yeah, that's probably better.
That's the ones I use in teaching my students, actually.
So do I.
What else?
I have
Yes.
a question. So if you're not going to discard any study based on your appraisal, as long as it meets your inclusion criteria related to design, and so then you're going to take care of what that through moderator analysis. Then what do you do if you don't have the data you need to conduct the moderator analysis? How much further along are you than if you had said, made a judgment, two reviewers sitting down using a standard tool of some sort that isn't a scale but a set of criteria, and they come together and they make their joint decision about whether to include or exclude?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, and this is, again, another thing that happens a lot, right? We get to, my argument was you should set very few highly defensible exclusion criteria and then treat everything else as a moderator analysis. And so what Lisa is saying is, you know, a lot of times you can't do the moderator analysis because you need some certain number of studies within each category to have sort of relatively stable estimates. And then so she says, well, how far are you down the road then. And what I would argue is at that point it's easier then to make more restrictive inclusion criteria than it is to go the other way, right? So perhaps, I've never done this, I've never seen it done, but you could say if we cannot do meta-analysis, if we cannot do moderator analysis, then we're going to go to Plan B, right? But we still have those studies for Plan B right here, and they're already coded. So you've got that. So it's pretty easy to switch gears at that point, and that's really similar to the question of lumping versus splitting, if you've ever heard it put that way. So sometimes people, I'm a classic lumper. If there's anybody here, they want to put everything together in the same pot, and then it turns out that we separate them later. But there are other people who say, I want to look at these very focused research questions, and I'll look at this one here, and then I'll look at this one here, and I'll look at this one here. If you start with this lumping review, you can always split later on. If you start with a split review, it's harder to build them back up, right? And so that's what how I would answer that.
Well, and so just to follow on that, what if you use some risk of bias approach, so a la Cochrane? I know it's not statistical, but it's interpretable.
Yes. So you could use some system like the Cochrane tool to say only everything that gets anything with a high risk of bias we're going to exclude as a sensitivity analysis at the end. And you could do those sensitivity analyses different ways. A lot of us prefer to do them as moderator tests where we compare one category to another. Probably the more common way is to simply drop the things that you are suspicious about. And so that could be done too. And that follows very nicely from what you're talking about. And my group in Cochrane would probably do that approach. So we might say we're going to teach within the very narrow bounds of quality variation in Cochrane reviews, we're going to treat it as an empirical question. But if we can't do that, then we're just going to drop all these guys out and we're going to base our conclusions on the strongest evidence. Surely there are more questions than that. It is the end of the day. And drinks are 43 minutes away. Well, thank you very much for coming today. It's nice to have a full room to play to, as they say. So thank you.